Thanks everyone for being here. Hi again, this is Get the Money. Very excitingly titled presentation, and really a chance for us to come together as CS&S programs, and especially hosted by the Event Fund for our first seminar series to talk about kind of fiscal sponsorship and also other ways to receive and administer grants and donations. I'm Angela Okune. I lead the Event Fund program at CS&S, and I am freckled with short black hair, brown eyes that kiss in the corner, like the name of my favorite children's book. I'm wearing blue-green glasses, and I'm speaking to you from Okune territory, or San Francisco, in California, in the US. And I'm really, really glad to have you all here. Thank you so much. Closed captioning is enabled. So if you would like to turn it on, you should be able to see the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And a reminder to myself and also speakers that this works best when we speak slowly. So just to quickly go over the logistics, we have a public doc here, and I've put the link to this slide deck into the chat. So you should be able to actually access and click on the public doc even through the slides here. We also will be recording this section, but not recording the Q&A. And we have a code of conduct that applies to this call and all of our other Event Fund and CS&S spaces. So feel free to read that as well. There are anonymous reporting linked here, and you can also alternatively email community@codeforscience.org. At any time during the event, you can type a question either in the Google Doc or in the Zoom chat, and we'll hold them for the Q&A section. And again, I mentioned earlier, but we're going to be collecting resources in the document as well. So feel free to add that in. And if you think of others over the next 24 hours, it'll stay open. And so you can keep adding them in as well. So in terms of our agenda today, next slide, we are just going to jump right into brief presentations from our panelists. So everyone will have about 8 to 10 minutes. And then I hope that really leaves us ample time for Q&A. This seminar brings together fiscal sponsors and also project leaders to really think about and offer advice and suggestions for how to think about supporting your project goals from an operational standpoint. And so we're not going to go into the details of how to get money. Maybe you're here for that. We're not going to go into details of that, but really dive into considerations for what to take into account once you've received or been awarded a grant. So what's next after you get an award letter? I'm hoping you're really going to come away with an understanding of how to determine the kind of best operational configuration to receive your grant money. And especially thinking about what factors you should be taking into consideration, what questions you should ask potential partners, the things you should keep in mind. So again, we have an amazing panel of experts that I'm so excited to be hearing from today. I invited these speakers because they each have kind of a unique perspective that I think we can all gain from on this question of the kinds of operational configurations that make sense for getting grant money. So if we can go to the next slide. These are our incredible speakers. We will hear first from the CS&S team, my colleagues who lead the Fiscal Sponsor Program. So Jessica and Moni, and Danielle Robinson our executive director, will also share with us some of her insights. And then we'll hear from Ben Nickolls, who is the executive director of Open Source Collective. And Ben will share with us how the Open Collective platform is unique and how different people are using Open Collective as their kind of operational infrastructure. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Gilbert, who will share with who's the director of programs at Pollicy. And he'll be sharing with us his experience, especially from the perspective of an Event Fund grantee, some of the lessons that they've learned, especially as a group that's located outside of the US. So with pleasure, I want to turn it over to Danielle Robinson, who is the Executive Director of Code for Science and Society, to briefly share her thoughts about the considerations for first-time grant recipients. And Danielle, feel free to use this slide as you'd like.
All right, I'm going to take it away. Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Robinson. I am a white lady based in Portland, Oregon. I have lots of gray hair, and you can see toddler toys behind me. I am the executive director of Code for Science and Society. We do fiscal sponsorship as well as grant making. And so my goal here is to do a little bit of jargon busting to set the stage for the other speakers. So fiscal sponsorship, what is it? Well, it's kind of like a thing that the US tax code invented. It is difficult for entities that have a lot of money and would like to make investments in the space. It can be difficult for them to give funds to groups that aren't properly designated under the US tax code. So fiscal sponsorship in the US is a system or an agreement where a project can work with an entity that has a public charity or another type of nonprofit designation to receive their money and administer it and make the project happen without that group needing to go and get its own 501c3 or 501c6 or whatever the US tax designation is. There's a lot of compliance and work that goes into maintaining those public charity statuses in the states. And so it allows working with a fiscal sponsor allows a group that is emerging, a group that is smaller, a group that is wants to manage one grant to do one thing and then may not continue after that, to receive the money and do the work without needing to take on all the compliance of running their own nonprofit. Fiscal sponsorship, there are two models that we have this little silly diagram of. It's not silly, but it's a little shape diagram. There are two models that are pretty common that I wanted to point out. One is the Model A fiscal sponsorship agreement, and that's where in that model, a project becomes a part of the nonprofit and the work is sort of designated to a restricted fund inside the nonprofit. Another model is this common is Model C, and that's called also a re-grant model. So that would be where an organization gets a grant in and then subgrants it out to another organization, and that party does all of their own bookkeeping. And we can talk more about, there are fortunately or unfortunately many other models of fiscal sponsorship, but those are two that I see used commonly in the space. Fiscal sponsorship is not quite the same as receiving a grant at a big university. Big universities, especially for small grants, they may have a department that can receive the small grant, but you're not going to probably, the entity, the university will sign the grant agreement and stuff. They have other processes, and actually Julie, who's on the call, might have some perspective, or Leslie might have some perspective on best things to think about when receiving a grant at your university, so that the money doesn't just go into the university's black box and you never see it again, or you see some of it, but not all of it. Fiscal sponsorship often involves an agreement between the project and the fiscal sponsor. So when we do fiscal sponsorship, or when Open Collective does fiscal sponsorship, there's some kind of agreement where they're agreeing for a fee to perform the accounting and bookkeeping and give us reporting on the finances. And so I'm going to stop there because there's a lot more I could say on this, but my goal was really to say, this is the basics of what fiscal sponsorship is. And if there are questions, I can take them right away, but we might want to go into the other people to keep things moving.
Yeah, let's keep things moving, and we can close this now. Thank you so much for sharing the screen as well. And we can, just to flag that some of this is also detailed in the resources. So there's a handbook, and a section on what is fiscal sponsorship that Danielle wrote several years ago. And so all of that is in the resources.
As I wrote it several years ago, I'm we did characterize Open Collective as Model C, but I don't know if that's accurate anymore. I think you do some Model A now too. So we can talk about all of that, but the point of this is we want to get to like, how can, not just like how can you get a grant, but how can you get the money to pay the people that you want to pay them? And fiscal sponsorship can be a tool to get your people paid. And my team will talk more about some considerations.
Thanks, Danielle. Over to Jess and Moni. Yeah.
So I'm going to share a few things that you should ask when you're looking for a fiscal sponsor. Either ask them, or a lot of this is based off of the questions that we ask projects that are interested in joining CS&S, because we're really interested in helping projects find the right place for them and their operations. So I'm going to go through a list pretty quickly so I don't take up too much time, but you want to ask what kind of projects they support as a fiscal sponsor. So do they have a limited scope or a focus in the type of projects they support? So CS&S, for example, we support projects in the open source, open science, open data spaces. And that also is like our area of expertise. You'll also want to ask a lot about their application process, because fiscal sponsors might have a different timeline for when they accept applications and review them. Some of them do it on a rolling basis. Sometimes it's annual. So you want to ask about that and how long that process takes to apply, because a lot of times the projects that come to us, or in the case of like the title of this presentation, you've got the money and you need a place for it. And sometimes there's like, a push for a timeline there. You'll also want to know what their costs are like and their fee structures, because they can be a little different from sponsor to sponsor. Some have relatively high fiscal sponsorship fees, like they might take 25, 50% of overhead costs for your grant. CS&S, right now our fee structure is 15% on cash received. And if it's like a government grant or something, there might be a higher rate for that. So you want to ask about that. That'll help you with your budgeting. A big thing when it comes to operations is asking a fiscal sponsor what their accounts payable process looks like for their projects. So is there support for hiring domestic employees and contractors and paying those people? Is there support for international employees and contractors? And are there restrictions around that? And also you want to ask, like, can you make small payments or honoraria? What's that process like? Can you make payments via PayPal, for instance? Like, how easy is it for your project to like move the money around and pay people? And how long does that take? What's their typical turnaround time for payments? A lot of projects might want to know if you're doing crowdfunding, are there limitations on that with the fiscal sponsor? And how, like, what's the process for being able to accept donations if you're fiscally sponsored by them? If your project has volunteer labor, you'll definitely want to ask about that. Are there restrictions around it? And somewhat related, you'll want to know if there's any type of like legal support that they provide. So in the case of volunteer labor, if you're doing in-person events, you'll want to ask if the fiscal sponsor has liability insurance coverage and what are the limitations there, who would be covered under that. Also related to legal support, you might want to ask if your project is especially like developing a product or something, you may want to learn about what their policies are around IP and copyright. For instance, if it's a Model A fiscal sponsorship or a comprehensive one, that may mean that they own your project's IP and they kind of manage it for you. And lastly, one of the most important things I think is just check with them and see if you can speak to any of the other projects that they fiscally sponsor. Because it's always great to hear from other people that are working in that ecosystem where, what works and what doesn't, and get an idea if it fits for your project or not.
Thank you so much, Jess. I hope, I'm glad we recorded it because I think there's a lot of good questions there that hopefully can refer back.
Write a checklist on that.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And I can work with you to work on one maybe. Moni, do you want to close the CS&S team with some suggestions from your end?
Yeah, so we just covered up most of the questions that we would ask our new projects to ask their fiscal sponsor. And then some questions that we received that Jess didn't mention were just what you should expect when you're starting out with your fiscal sponsor. So what does the onboarding process look like, you know, financially, but also, you know, governance, strategy, what is your fiscal sponsor expecting? And then another thing on the opposite side is more so offboarding. So how can your fiscal sponsor support you in becoming a 501c3? And what does that process look like? Or whatever independent organization that you would like to become. Also, sorry for the weak voice. I'm currently coming off of a COVID bout. Yeah, but that's about it.
Thank you so much for joining us, Moni, and I hope you get better soon. And yeah, thanks again for being here. So we'll hold on any questions. Please do note them into the document or in the chat, and we'll go straight over to Ben to share a little bit more about Open Collective.
Thank you very much. So hello, I'm Ben. I am a white male with dark, not black, but very dark brown hair. And I am in a white room with some wooden kind of constructions, timber frame building in Shropshire in the UK. I am the executive director of Open Source Collective, which is a host organization, a fiscal sponsor, however you want to kind of refer to that particular situation, for at the moment just over 3,000 open source projects on the Open Collective platform. I would say that Open Collective and its relationship to Open Source Collective can be quite confusing. The easiest way for me to sort that confusion out is to introduce myself as I just have. So Open Collective is a platform, and that platform is used by many hosts, some of which have Open and Collective in their name. Another, for example, is Open Collective Foundation. But Open Collective as a platform was created to effectively enable this kind of abstraction. So I'll talk a little bit about the kind of philosophy of Open Collective, and then I'll try and talk a little bit about the like hard and fast practicalities of being an open source collective hosted project. The first thing is to kind of say that Open Collective was started in, I think, 2016. Open Source Collective was started just shortly after in 2017 as effectively the first vertical. The idea for Open Collective was that effectively it was a platform to enable a new form of association for groups that don't necessarily have a strong connection with one another. And open source software was the perfect kind of first vertical example of those kinds of communities who work together where perhaps trust isn't as strong between members of that community. And as a result, the kind of tooling around that group needs to be able to reflect the state of, for instance, how you're using money in a group in order to build that trust between members of the group. And that's really what kind of makes us unique. So Open Source Collective on the Open Collective platform and all hosts on the Open Collective platform use the platform, which is predominantly for fundraising and managing and spending money as a group transparently. So the budget for projects is pretty much 100% transparent. You can contribute to projects using an incognito or guest profile, but if you are working as a group on a project, the idea is that at any point, anyone can see the amount of money that that project has raised, the amount of money that that project has distributed, spent on its activities or expenses, and who is effectively, benefiting from that project, being paid to work on it, being reimbursed for expenses, and so on and so forth. That really is the thing that makes us unique across all of the hosts that are using Open Collective as a platform. Open Source Collective exists basically to create a sustainable and healthy ecosystem for open source in the broadest kind of sense. We do a lot of things outside of hosting open source projects, but obviously I'm here to talk about our fiscal hosting program, which honestly is probably about 90% of our activities. It's the main thing that we do. We do it with a very small team because the platform enables us to do that. We're hosting on any given month around 1,500 active projects. So they're either receiving some funding or they are spending some money on furthering their project. We support and host any project that has an open source license, as long as that project has a degree of traction, which at the moment is measured via a proxy metric, something like how many GitHub stars they have. But we are always open and very flexible to receiving applications where that effective proxy metric doesn't exist. And honestly, we're trying to move away from that so that we're looking instead at contribution history, so that we can see that there's a 6-month history of people actually working on a project, or a kind of provable kind of set of dependent projects or people or organizations that are using that project in their work. But at the moment, there is a proxy metric. The way in which we kind of work with projects, I think, is quite unique as well. As I say, we host very many projects, and we have quite a lightweight engagement with those projects. We focus on enabling those projects to collect money. So there are various kind of features of the platform, which I'm happy to answer questions about, that enable you to raise funds for the platform, for your project. So for instance, you can raise money from sponsorship. You can raise money by offering access to people in the project, lots of kind of flexible ways in which you can effectively kind of gather support for your project. We also have integrations with things like GitHub sponsors, and working on integrations with things like Patreon and so on. The main idea is that we are as flexible as possible and support as many modes as possible to get money to the project so that we can represent it in the budget and you can use it. Really, that is, from a strategic kind of perspective, the thing that, like, having just published my strategy in January, the goal is to get projects spending money. So that's what we want to kind of see, and that's what we want to encourage. So what we try to focus on is enabling projects to get that money to people who are working to further the cause of the project. And we run payments twice a week. We accept applications on a daily basis, and we typically pay out any expenses or invoices for projects within the week. And that is, pretty much our primary focus. The reason for that is that, we want to be the broadest kind of mechanism for open source projects to be able to come together. We have kind of a cute kind of soundbite thing, like it's kind of like we want people to bring the same principles to managing their money as they do to managing code, right? In the open, together as a community and so on. That does make us less appropriate, I think, for projects that have a single kind of maintainer or person that does most of the driving of that project. It does potentially make us less appropriate for people who work across a number of projects. And I think we're kind of happy to accept that, to be honest. The main kind of thing that we are driving for is that we genuinely believe that open source software is most sustainable when it is built by groups of people. And we accept the situation that often these groups of people don't always have 100% trust, and we are trying to build a platform for them to build that trust together, and to use money to kind of further the cause of their project. So yeah, that's like an overview of Open Collective. I'm happy to answer questions on some of the more kind of practical kind of elements of how we manage kind of applications and so on. In a lot of cases, it can be immediate. We have integration with GitHub specifically, and we're looking at doing the same with GitLab to be able to say, yep, cool, you've got the right license, and we can see through a proxy metric at the moment, or a real metric, that you have the kinds of features of a project that would be beneficial for us. And yeah, like that's the idea, is that we can accept you ASAP and you can kind of get to work. So the other thing to note that is particularly relevant to this is that we also support groups that are closely aligned with open source projects that are more kind of event driven. So meetups, conference organization, and just general kind of like working groups. We also support those. Again, we are relatively flexible in the definition of it, but we do like to see a very strong association with a single project. We tend to not accept applications that are yay open source as much as we would love to. And yeah, that's the kind of requirement on that side as well. So
Thank you so much for that, Ben. And I believe we'll probably have several questions for you. But before we get to Q&A, I would love to hand it over to Gilbert to speak from his experience as an event fund grantee. And also I'm seeing a question already that might be relevant that Gilbert, you could tackle around, understanding how being outside of the US, how the US tax regime might affect you or not affect you. So one of the questions here was about location. And, I know that your team has worked on some of that infrastructuring. So over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Danielle, and thank you very much, everyone. I think for me, I'll first give a background of who we are so that can also put things into perspective. Pollicy is a civ tech organization based out of Kampala, but working across sub-Saharan Africa. We only have one office and it's in Kampala. We started as a company, but now we've transitioned into a non-profit because of some of these technicalities of receiving funding. And one of our main source of funding has been grants. And when it comes to grants, issues of taxation, but also the country laws come into play. And initially when we were company, we were basically doing consultancy work. So most of the work, the funds we were getting were kind of charging it as consultancy work. But most of our work was mainly funded by non-profits or charity organizations outside Uganda, especially those ones in the US and the UK. And really had to make a decision as an organization to transition from a company into a non-profit. But as we are transitioning as a non-profit, one of our funder, or one of our actually current biggest funder, had to do a due diligence to make sure that we have all the systems in place. And one of the things, I think Danielle has touched on it, around the tax issues around the US and receiving charitable money, being a 501c organization. And that kind of put us in a state where we had to do an equivalent determination through NGO source. This process kind of helps you to determine your organization if it's going to use the money or the resources, the funds that they're receiving from a US charity or any other charity organization for charitable work back in the country that they're in. So that is a very technical and tedious process, but what helps at the end of the day, you get a certificate that any charity or any funding organization within the US that is looking to fund an equivalent organization that is 501c equivalent outside the US can utilize and provide you resources. And I think Benjamin has touched on it. When you have so many running projects, sometimes getting a fiscal sponsor becomes also hard because you have so many fiscal sponsors. But when you have this equivalent determination, you're able to receive the money directly to your organization. So that is one thing that Pollicy has put in place, but also that makes you be very transparent in your expenditure, meaning you also have to do annual audit reports for your organization. So you need to hire one certified accounting firms to do audits, and these audits you have to be ready to share them with any funder who is going to support you with resources. I think then you do a lot of administrative work internally, yet with fiscal sponsors, some of this work is passed on to the host organization. I think for me, that's what I'm going to speak about, and briefly, but there are a lot of resources online that you can utilize, especially NGO Source has kind of documented this process of getting equivalency determination certificate. So if you go on there, and I think I put one of the resources in there, you can read through. In most cases, it's the funding organization that approaches open NGO source to do the due diligence on their behalf. So it takes around maximum a month because there's a lot of back and forth, so many questions they ask depending on which country you're in and how, what kind of legal documents you have as an entity. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. I think I've got just a quick question that anyone is invited to answer because I think this is a common one. What is often included in overhead costs? And I think this is a question, especially as people are working on revising their budgets. Sometimes we don't think of including a percentage. And so if people want to throw in some common items that would fit under overhead costs.
Yeah, I'd love to tag in Ben on this, but I think you want to make sure that the accounting and financial reporting is covered in any overhead costs that you're paying, and that you understand whether you'll be having any insurance protection or IP obligations to the organization that's receiving the funds. So just like getting clarity on what the organization that will receive the funds is going to do for you and how much it's going to cost. As Jess mentioned, some orgs have like sliding scales. Some orgs have a fixed fee structure, but it had better cover the financial administration, the bookkeeping, and the reporting so that you can report out to your funder. Ben, what do you? I'm sure there's more that could be covered under overhead, and it really depends org to org. So, what's on your mind for Open Collective in terms of overhead?
I'm trying to think about it in terms of like for Open Collective and personally, because I've been in this position. In 2016, I submitted my first grant application to the Ford Foundation and the Sloan Foundation, and I had to include an amount of overhead. And just thankfully, the Ford Foundation at the time, and I believe they probably still do something similar, forced you to include, I think it was a 20, maybe 25% overhead. And I remember thinking at the time, that's a little bit weird. From Open Collective's point of view, you know, we charge 10% on funds managed. And I think that's representative of the relatively lightweight engagement that we have with projects. That's kind of core financials and it's very much supported by the platform. It's very easy for us to report back to funders where the money has been spent, how much is left, all of those kinds of things that you would expect to be able to receive. I would say that if you are having to do a degree of marketing and so on, then you would also want to consider the costs of travel, the cost of accommodation. Certainly we don't currently, but will be shortly offering event kind of liability insurance and so on. At the moment, we kind of rely on individual event organizers to arrange that for themselves, but we're going to get one policy to kind of fit all. Yeah, I think costs of maintaining kind of services and communications and so on is all included in that as well. So yeah, there's a lot to include. And as a general kind of guide, I now try to look at that kind of 20-25% figure as a good guide. And if I can't think of things that I haven't thought about to get to that, I'm like, I must be missing something. Yeah.
I'd like to add something there. I think one of the things we've tried to do is to make sure we incorporate the definition of overhead costs in our finance manual. That also helps us in terms of negotiation with the donor. For example, most donors don't want to go beyond 25 or yes, mostly 25, but most of them are around 15 and below percentage. But if you have it clearly defined in your finance manual, and when you're engaging with the donor, and kind of let them know that this is basically what your overhead costs mean and what it covers, then there's room for you to settle down. So you need to sit down as an organization and determine what is overhead and then what percentage do you take as an organization. So it needs to be clearly stated in your finance manual. And that has really helped us a lot when we're applying for grants and we put in a certain percentage. I think on our end, it's either 10% or 15%.